I think it's important that we step back for a minute, though, from these aggregate results and recognize that as exciting as they can be, they do not capture, they do not highlight the specific innovations and transformations that underlie the overall numbers. Your sites, simply stated, have been at the cutting edge of developments in juvenile justice that are now influencing the entire country. And I'm going to mention a few, and I hope no one feels in any way diminished in not being included in this short list. But for example, Judge Steve Teske and his colleagues in Clayton County have taken the lead nationally in disrupting what we all now know as the school-to-prison pipeline, helping to establish different approaches that prevent the wholesale criminalization of typical adolescent behavior that Senator Whitmire so criticized last evening. Numerous JDAI sites, especially those benefiting from the technical assistance of our colleagues at the W. Haywood Burns Institute, have begun chipping away at the racial disparities and disproportionality that shame a system that includes justice in its name. Progress in addressing the unique pathways and challenges that result in the detention of girls can be found in places as far-flung as Rhode Island and Alabama, and Massachusetts and Nevada, thanks in part to guidance provided by Professor Fran Sherman, who unfortunately can't be here because she's off in China helping them figure out how to have a gender-specific juvenile justice system. Newly emerging partnerships with police agencies in places like Portland, Oregon, and Indianapolis have expanded system capacities to respond to youth more appropriately and more effectively than was the norm as recently as only a few years ago. This list could go on and is reflected in multiple workshops over the course of the next 2 days that highlight the thoughtful innovations that have made the aggregate results that I just mentioned possible. But these impressive innovations and related results should not and cannot be cause for complacency on our parts. JDAI, as a movement for detention reform and for juvenile justice transformation, faces some key challenges over the next few years that we need to address collectively. First and foremost, we need to ensure that the detention reforms that your sites have implemented are both sustained and scaled up. These challenges, I believe, are intimately related. It is simply not very likely that we can expand JDAI to new sites, that is, to address the scale challenge, if we do not establish mechanisms to sustain the reforms and to sustain our network. Sustaining detention reforms requires new capacities at the local, at the state, and at the national levels. In sites, especially those where the initiative's been underway for a long time and some of the initial energy may have waned, we need tools and we need processes that effectively enable us and enable site personnel themselves to identify aspects of policy and practice that require further improvement and that track whether fidelity to the core strategies is being maintained. In this regard, a revised system assessment framework is being designed and tested, intended for application locally. And there'll be a workshop covering that new tool. Similarly, important improvements in data collection and analysis tools for JDAI sites are being implemented, also to be covered in another workshop. Important progress is being made to scale JDAI up in various states, that is, to expand the number of counties that have implemented the reforms that you know are at the heart of this initiative. Objective screening tools, expedited case process, effectively targeted alternatives, structured response grids to address probation violations, and all the myriad of best practices that you are familiar with. With the benefit of New Jersey serving as a learning laboratory, multiple states are now building their own capacities to ensure that justice, at least as it relates to detention, is not a function of geography. We should not underestimate this challenge. The simple reality is that detention in most places is a local function, and even when it is a state function, it tends to reflect local legal culture, and most states simply do not have the planning, training, data, or oversight capacities designed to facilitate transfer of knowledge from existing JDAI counties to non-participating sites. The workshop on going to scale will feature presentations by a number of states who will share how they are approaching and trying to solve these dilemmas and challenges. Sustaining and scaling JDAI is going to be much more likely if we can also succeed in figuring out what the future of our infrastructure and our network ought to be. For 2 decades now, the Annie E. Casey Foundation has been proud to serve as both the developer of that infrastructure and the convener of this network. And these are roles, I assure you, that we are not soon to forsake. However, if over the long term JDAI sites are to be at the center of major shifts in juvenile justice, if the network is to remain a powerful force for progress, collectively, we need to begin discussions about what the future ought to look like. How should the infrastructure that's been built, the technical assistance, the training seminars, the help desk, the model sites, the publications, how should those things be embedded in our field so that they are available to the many, many people who are not in this room with us today? How ought the network be maintained? Should JDAI sites organize themselves into regional and national associations? Put another way, we need to think 10 years from now, how will the supports, the standards, the communications, and the energy that we now think of collectively as the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative continue? Now's the time for us to start answering those questions, particularly because of the potential that exists for juvenile justice reform at this moment while we meet. Evidence is mounting from all parts of the country that policymakers, justice system officials, and whole communities are prepared to eschew the policies of mass incarceration that have been at the center of crime policy for the past 4 decades. This shift is not restricted to Democratic or Republican states or to specific parts of the country. It is increasingly embraced by people and organizations of all political persuasions. It is a portent of a different future, one that recognizes that mass incarceration has proven a fiscally unsustainable approach to public safety, that maintains and exacerbates racial and ethnic disadvantages, disrupts families unnecessarily, undermines communities, and disregards new knowledge about how to respond more effectively to crime. Juvenile justice has been at the forefront of this movement to reduce reliance on incarceration and to divorce ourselves from the policies of mass incarceration. And we have been at the forefront, quite honestly, for good reason. As was so effectively documented late last year by our intrepid writer, Dick Mendel. Dick, where are you? Stand up and take a bow, please. And if you haven't noticed it in your conference binders, you have a hard copy of No Place for Kids. I encourage you to read it. It is our effort to document the flaws in juvenile corrections in the United States and to lay out an alternative vision. Suffice it to say, these institutions are chronically unsafe and often abusive, that they are producing recidivism rates that all of us should find unacceptable, especially for the $88,000 a year per bed that they cost on average. They tend to house large numbers of kids who frustrate and anger us rather than kids who make us afraid. They are inconsistent with the most current knowledge about what works to change delinquent careers, and we can quite simply and must do better. And fortunately, we are. These data show the increasing pace of deinstitutionalization in multiple states. Not only have we seen significant drops in juvenile confinement, we see an increasing pace of deinstitutionalization. JDAI sites have been at the forefront of these changes, and the data that I reviewed earlier only confirm that. Here's a different take of the same trend. States reducing reliance on juvenile incarceration are depicted in reddish colors, those increasing in blue. The top are the starting in 1997 data, and the most recent data are at the bottom. And as you can see, the map of the country is turning increasingly red, revealing not its political inclinations, but in fact, its reduced reliance on confinement. This trend is not only encouraging to juvenile justice reformers, it is essential for juvenile justice reform, because juvenile justice reform, driven by an ambition to safely reduce reliance on commitments and placements, is perhaps the most powerful transformational tool that we can have for 4 basic reasons. First of all is the Willie Sutton reason. That is, this is where the money is. And all of us in this room who would hope for a system with greater investment in delinquency prevention and greater investment in early and effective intervention will continue to be wishing late at night and not getting what we want because the money is all going down the incarceration drain. Second, as we've learned so well in JDAI, safe reductions in confinement occur not when we simply develop a new alternative program, but rather when we make changes up and down the case processing continuum, when we transform the system in multiple ways, including narrowing the pipeline of cases, improving probation practice, strengthening defense representation, controlling lengths of stay consistent with what the research says makes sense. So the goal of safely reducing the system's deep end demands that we embrace a variety of best practices at all critical points, and thus can precipitate comprehensive system reform, not just a reduction of the numbers. Third, reducing reliance on confinement can be the spur to innovation and experimentation that have been for far too long missing from our system. If we take away the safety net of incarceration for low-risk youth, systems will have to do better jobs engaging families, making decisions, investing resources. And finally, if we restrict our reliance on commitments and placements, this could be what we finally need to focus system accountability on results that genuinely matter, on whether court-involved kids are better behaved, better educated, happier, not simply on process measures like admissions and discharges and failed urine tests. If JDAI has taught us anything, is that a trend like this will neither reach its full potential nor weather the predictable challenges of changes in crime pattern and fiscal fortunes without intentionality. That is, no matter how compelling the argument may be for reducing incarceration, and as exciting as the recent trends may be to many of us, getting a juvenile justice system that eliminates inappropriate and unnecessary incarceration and at-home placements is not going to happen absent a concerted and prolonged movement. The trends that I have been showing you earlier represent primarily idiosyncratic, state-specific developments. They are not yet representative of a clear national policy consensus nor an organized movement of sites. And that's why now is the proper and the perfect time to expand the focus of JDAI to include the dispositional end of the system.